Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. With the first 3 races of the season behind us, it's time to draw a small or perhaps even somewhat larger interim conclusion. An interim summary of which teams have improved in particular, an interim summary of which teams were right at the other end of the scale. I'll say it a bit in advance. For me, there is a relatively clear winner and a very clear loser. I'm curious to see if you see it the same way as I do after analyzing the data. I'll start by saying that data is always one of those things. You can work it out either way. Don't trust any statistics that you haven't falsified yourself, so you can interpret it one way or the other. We've tried to do it to the best of our knowledge and belief. Let's start by looking at the absolute performance rating, i.e. we look at the lap times for the 2023 season and the lap times for the 2024 season. The first 3 circuits were exactly the same: Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and Australia. On the one hand, it's nice to have a year-on-year comparison, but on the other hand, the whole thing also has its pitfalls. We'll see why in a moment. On the one hand, Pirelli has done us a favor. The construction and compounds have remained unchanged, but the choice of tire compounds has changed slightly, namely in Melbourne, but that's more or less manageable. We don't look at the fastest laps in qualifying. No, we look at the accumulated best sector times. You could also say that you look at Russell's best time in the first sector, Hamilton's best time in the second, and then add them together. But that would be unfair because you can have a different setup and then different strengths and weaknesses on the racetrack. No, we look at each driver individually when adding them up. Why do we even bother looking at the sector times and not just the lap times? We've already seen this season that one driver doesn't get the lap right because he makes a small driving mistake, which of course distorts the whole thing a bit, and that's why we took the trouble to calculate it. But enough of the preamble, let's take a look at who has improved the most. That's McLaren, of course, and that's what I mentioned earlier, the year-on-year comparison, which of course has its pitfalls. Why was it clear that McLaren had improved the most? Because they started the season incredibly badly last year. Then came the big update in Austria, and since then they have, of course, been much stronger. So in absolute terms, 1.55 seconds on average over the first 3 races improved per lap in the qualifying trim. Then Racing Bulls were also relatively clear in second place. They had a big update in Singapore and improved by 1.35 seconds. Then it gets a bit more exciting, and third place really surprised me. And on average, Ferrari finished there with an improvement of 8.5 tenths of a second. And why am I surprised here? Because Ferrari were also really good in qualifying trim at the start of last season. This season, however, they have improved again, so that is a first small exclamation mark. Behind them, the other teams are relatively close together, so Ferrari is no longer a big outlier. Not like McLaren or the Racing Bulls, the teams from 3rd to 8th place in the standings are between 8 and 15ths of a second behind. If we then go further back, things get a little more interesting again, namely Haas, who have only improved by just under 4 tenths of a second in absolute terms. Yes, we'll talk a bit more about that later, but there wasn't that much catching up to do in qualifying. You have to keep that in mind. And now there's an absolute outlier, that's Alpine, which many people probably expected. While all the teams have improved relatively significantly, even Haas in 9th place is almost 4 tenths of a second faster than last year. But Alpine in last place is slower than last season with almost 1 tenth. And you have to let that sink in. The technical regulations have practically not changed. Yes, there are slightly different regulations for the rollover structure and so on, but not significantly. And then 1 year of development and you're driving slower than in the previous season, that's pretty significant. Incidentally, the teams have improved by an average of 0.75 seconds. Let's take a look at the second rating, the relative performance. That's perhaps the really interesting thing about Formula One. Over the winter, the teams always say that we've found so much, we've got a great car, but then they go out on the track and see that, okay, maybe the other competitors have found a bit more than we have, and that's why this relative improvement is actually more interesting. Now you can say you look at the relative improvement, yet what are you looking at? Do you look at the start of the season again? Do you look at the season mix? At this point, I decided to take the last races of the 2023 season, but then we had a city circuit with Las Vegas, which was very atypical. Then we had a sprint in Brazil. So I just picked out representative circuits like Japan and Abu Dhabi, and then calculated the average value and compared that with the first three. So, to cut a long story short, what does it actually look like now? And that's a bit more interesting because you can really see which team has made a big step over the winter. And in this ranking, Aston Martin is actually in first place. They have improved by almost 0.6 of a second compared to the competition. If you think about it now, how did last season go for Aston Martin? Yes, they had major difficulties at the end of last season, and that probably explains the big jump over the winter. But there is a second reason which we will look at in more detail in the next category. In second place in terms of relative improvement is Ferrari, almost 0.3 of a second closer to the competition than at the end of last season. So you can see that Ferrari is firmly established at the top. It is also interesting to note that Sauber is in third place in this ranking. But that's because, like Aston Martin, they were relatively far behind at the end of last season. They were in 10th place in those two races I just mentioned. Now they are in 9th position, 0.2 of a second up on the competition. That's a bit of a catch-up over the winter, but of course it's still a long way off what they need. Behind them, everything has remained very, very similar, it has to be said. Williams, Red Bull, Mercedes, the Racing Bulls. At the beginning of this season, at the end of last season, all within a few hundredths of a second. It's more interesting with McLaren because they have deteriorated in relative terms. But you have to be careful here. Of course, the track characteristics also play a certain role. Bahrain has never really been McLaren's favorite track. In contrast to Suzuka, for example, where the McLaren was really good, so we might have to take that with a pinch of salt, but we don't have to take Alpine with a grain of salt at this point. It's also quite clear that they lost relatively more than half a second. So that's quite a chunk and shows how bad the French really are in 2024 and above all how badly they have developed. Another very interesting point is that if you look at the relative performance, you always say that everything is so much tighter and so on. It is not that much tighter depending on how you do the math. At the front of the field, however, it has actually become much tighter. At the end of last season, Red Bull already had a decent lead over the competition on representative circuits. 0.3 of a second ahead of McLaren in the qualifying trim, and they were actually second. This season, you're just a 10th ahead of Ferrari, but what we also see is that there is actually a three-class society, Red Bull and Ferrari at the front, then a relatively large gap to McLaren, Aston Martin and Mercedes, and then from these three teams there is another very large gap to the remaining 5 teams. Last season we saw Red Bull racing at the front, then McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes behind them at the end of the season, then there was a gap and then the rest. So it's quite interesting to look at these developments. If you like numbers and rankings, then I recommend our latest print edition, number 95. Among other things, there is not only this beautiful Lewis Hamilton in the Ferrari overall for the 2025 season, but there is also a ranking of the driver duos. Which team has the best driver duo? Afterwards, I was not very surprised to what conclusion my colleagues Markus Steinrisser and Rebecca Bauer came to, but at the time it was perhaps still a little surprising. If you want to know what this ranking looks like, visit abo.motorsport-magazin.com. Now let's take a look at the race pace, and it's particularly difficult to make comparisons with race pace. On the one hand, of course, there is the race itself. We have virtual safety cars, we have traffic and so on. So there are so many distortions that if we just look at the gap you have at the end of the race, none of this makes any sense. Then, of course, there are also retirements. Max Verstappen in Australia, for example. What are you supposed to assess? That's why you have to compile the knowledge you've gathered over the last few races, and you can see that Ferrari has made the biggest leap of all the teams. They are not only really strong in qualifying now, I've just given you the figures, they've improved a lot there. Also in the race trim, what's that got to do with it? You have a much better all-rounder, and above all, you have a much more consistent car. The car is no longer so unpredictable, and that means you don't have to push the tires as hard. At the same time as the aerodynamic development, there is, of course, also a completely new rear axle spring damper unit. This is also a big reason why Ferrari is probably so much better in race trim, and that also applies to Haas. Haas is the second team that has made really big improvements in race trim. They get the rear axle and of course the front axle from Ferrari, so there's already been a big leap for free, plus of course the aerodynamic development. And if we look at the fact that Haas is on a lap, as you heard earlier, not improving in comparison to the other teams. Overall now, in terms of points, as we will see in a moment, they are in a much better position. That is why, of course, you have to say that Haas and Ferrari together are the biggest winners in terms of race pace. A very big loser, but for other reasons, is Sauber. Sauber did okay in qualifying, as we mentioned earlier, but in the race, nothing went right. Why? The pit stops. This is a very atypical reason for the race pace, but of course it's part of it. You have a problem with the wheel hub and wheel nut. That's why the pit stops sometimes take half a minute. You have to play it safe at the other pit stops. You lose a lot of time, but even that is no guarantee that you won't have a horror stop. This is a rather atypical reason, but it still costs an incredible amount of race time. Aston Martin has actually lost an incredible amount of race time, and that is a very interesting point in this season. I mentioned the improvement in qualifying at Aston Martin, which somehow seemed relatively high to me subjectively. But Aston Martin was not really strong in qualifying last season, and also at the start of the season, their strength was actually the race trim. This season, it seems to be a bit the other way around. They are a bit better in qualifying, but then they pay the price in race trim. This is one of the most interesting developments this season. As I mentioned at the beginning, you don't trust any statistics that you haven't falsified yourself. So there were a lot of figures, a lot of interpretations. I'm curious to hear what you have to say, but in the end, it's only the championship standing that decides. And what's the situation there? Haas is the team that has made the biggest leap in terms of position. Last year, 10th in the Constructors' Championship, now currently 7th, so they've climbed 3 places. The Racing Bulls are still up 2 places, but we mustn't forget that things were looking much better at the end of last year, and they are currently in 6th place. So that was a bit to be expected. Then behind them, there are no major shifts. Ferrari has overtaken Mercedes. McLaren have also jumped up 1 place by overtaking Mercedes. Anyone who has done the math now knows that Mercedes have lost 2 places. That makes them the 2nd worst team in this ranking. The worst? Well, 3 guesses. Alpine, of course, they slipped 4 places from 6th in the Constructors' Championship to 10th, which is, of course, quite a horror for the French team. So that's how it looks in the Constructors' standing, but we can also take a closer look at the points. But it has to be said that you have to be extremely careful because the point system in Formula One is not linear. There are 25 points for the winner, then only 18 for 2nd place, 15, 12, 10, and so on. You know the drill. I don't need to recite it now. That's why, of course, the good teams can potentially lose significantly more than the bad teams. Red Bull had an average of 39.9 points per race weekend last year. Haas, for example, had 0.55. Of course, a single outlier makes a much bigger difference. That's why it's not surprising that Red Bull, for example, lost an average of 6.76 points per Grand Prix. Mercedes, however, was the biggest loser with 9.92. This was also clearly due to the double retirement in Australia, which was, of course, particularly painful. The biggest winner at this point is Ferrari with an average gain of 12.55 points. 31 points on average in the 2024 season. That's already a decent number, and that's without sprinting. Yes, you may have heard it already. For me, the biggest winner of the season so far is Ferrari. Who would have thought that? In fact, my view was that they have a concept change ahead of them. There is a lot of potential there. Whether this potential is now enough to attack Red Bull is, of course, another story. By the way, I said the same thing about Mercedes. I wouldn't count them among the biggest winners. So for me, Ferrari is the biggest winner, followed by Haas, and then it gets a bit tighter behind that. If we look at the other end of the scale, I don't think we need to discuss it. Alpine is by far the biggest loser. If I had to name the 2nd biggest loser, for me it would probably be Mercedes. How do you see the whole thing? Have I done much ado about nothing and come to a completely wrong conclusion? Feel free to write it in the comments, write your ranking. Who is the biggest winner? Who is the biggest loser? Who is ahead overall? You can also write the top 10 for yourself. Feel free to write in how the teams stand with you, and then we can already look forward to the upcoming race weekend in Suzuka. Hopefully it will be as spectacular as Australia.